So we left off last week looking at Elihu and how Elihu, in this final speech in Job 37, he makes a personal appeal to Job about, get out of your mode of wanting to argue and deal with God like this and present your case like court and think that you're going to win. And he starts out that section in Job 37. At this, my heart pounds and leaps from its place. And he tells everybody around, listen to the roar of his voice, the rumbling that comes from his mouth, because it's possible he actually saw the storm approaching at this point. And he could actually see the lightning, the clouds, the whirlwind that was starting to come at the area. He says in verse 5 that God's voice thunders in marvelous ways. He does great things beyond our understanding. And this is what God is going to build on in his speeches tonight. He's going to show Job that he can do things way beyond our understanding, so why don't we trust him in his work in our life? And how he, as Elihu says there, he brings the snow and he brings the showers. And in verse 7, so that all men may know he's made all his work, and he stops every man from his labor. Even the animals, they take cover and remain in their dens because of God's awesome power. So out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold, and the breath of God, and so on. He goes through the natural things like God's going to do, but he mentions in verse 13, whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness, or in other words, for mercy and saving his people, he causes it to happen. And this is how Elihu sees this other side of God, that it's all about God trying to save people in his kindness. And he brings in his power to help people. So he says in verse 14, listen to this, Job, stop and consider God's wonders. So in other words, start trusting God. The natural creation should convince you of that. It's very similar to Paul's argument in Romans chapter 1 that God left on record the natural creation, and people should have known the works of God because of just looking at the natural creation. In verse 15, do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang poised, these wonders of him who is perfect in knowledge? And by the way, that phrase there, him who is perfect in knowledge, that actually came up back in chapter 36 and verse 4 when Elihu was speaking. And he said to Job, one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. And a lot of people think that Elihu was just being really lofty about himself and applying it to himself. But you can see here that Elihu isn't talking about himself. When he uses that phrase, him who is perfect in knowledge, it's about God, not about Elihu himself. So, can you join him in spreading out the skies and so on? It's like all these different things in the natural creation. So Job, in verse 19, tell us, what should we say to God? We can't prepare our case because our minds are dark. And he's answering this question, this predicament that Job had come to, pushed into the corner of thinking that he was going to build his case, find out what the charges were against him, and build his case to answer all these things. And he couldn't wait to talk to God, to clear his name and clear everything up. And our minds, he said, we're dark because we don't have the knowledge and the wisdom to understand all these things God is doing. And should he be told that I want to speak? Like that's what Job has been doing. Would any man dare to be destroyed by him? In other words, if you actually had a debate with God, it's not just his power that would overwhelm you, it's his wisdom, because we don't really understand what he's doing. And if he starts to explain it, it just blows us away of all the things that he's controlling. And in the same way that no one can look at the sun, it's too bright after the wind has swept the skies clean. That's what it would be like trying to have a debate with God. So out of the north, God comes in his shining glory. He comes in all his wonderful majesty. We can't reach up to the mighty one. He's lifted high because of his power. Everything he does is fair and right. So he doesn't crush people. And this is, again, answering part of what Job had felt. He thought God was not fair, God was not right, and that God had crushed him. And Elihu's point is that is why they have respect for God. He does not regard any who are wise of heart, or in other words, wise in their own minds. That God's got the power and the wisdom to control this world. And the basic outflowing from that is his ways must be just. We just don't understand them. So when God comes to answer Job, a lot of people get surprised by the fact that God doesn't directly answer Job's questions. And it's very similar to Jesus in the New Testament when people asked Jesus a question and he never gave a direct answer. And I do think it's because they've got wisdom way beyond all of us. What we tend to do is when one of our children comes up and asks a question, we answer the question. And then you know what happens. They have another question. And you answer that one. And then they have another question and another question. What God does is instead of answering Job's questions directly, is he gives a huge, big picture answer to Job, to which Job is just blown away by the fact that he didn't understand what God was doing. He was stuck inside a box of himself. And so this is the approach that God is going to take. He doesn't just answer the questions that Job might have today. He answers all the questions that Job has right now and in the future, because that's how God's going to approach the subject. And I think you'll see that as we go along. So chapter 38 is all about the inanimate creation. And instead of just trying to overwhelm Job with his power in the inanimate creation, I want you to see tonight how what he's trying to do is show Job that he's got the wisdom and the control in making the entire creation, and God treats the creation like it was a baby. And so Job is supposed to be realizing that if this is the control and the wisdom God has in the inanimate world, then certainly he can do the same thing in the living world as well. And it's going to show how God's got the wisdom and the power to control the wicked and save his children as we go through chapter 38. So the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. This is probably an angel talking to Job, just like it would have been with Moses. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Because, that's Job. You'll find out that he admits later on in chapter 42. Now, prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. This is the day Job had been waiting for, when he'd be able to talk to God. Only Job had gotten to the point at the end of his speeches where he was ready to go in like a prince, and he was going to lay out his case and start questioning God right away. And now God says, wait a minute, Job, I'm going to question you, and you give me some answers. So where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Going back to the original creation of our world, who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So do you understand, Job, what was going on in the original creation? Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? The angels were, but what about you, Job? Do you understand what was going on at that time? And so he's going to go on now and say, look at what I did at this point. Look at how I developed our creation. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? Isn't that interesting how he describes the sea coming out from the womb? He's using terminology that's like a baby. God was like creating his baby. And he made the sea burst forth from the womb. It comes out, but somebody's got to control it. Otherwise, it's just going to go wild over the entire world and wipe it out. So he says in verse 9, when I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. Now, I want you to see as we're going through chapters 38 and 39 and 40, how God keeps bringing up this idea of the natural things or the inanimate world or the animal world about the proud and God's wisdom and power to control pride, the proud. And so he wanted Job to see this in the natural creation, that when the waves came up and the waters came out from the earth and they started spreading out across it, God had the power and the wisdom to set limits for this, for the waves, in order for there to be life on the land. And his argument is going to be, Job, if I could do this, if I've got this wisdom and power to control the inanimate things like this, and I can control those proud waves, why would you think it's any different with pride in mankind? That God's going to set the basis for the fact that he can control the pride in man in a way that none of us could understand. Or have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it may take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? See, now I put these words in colors so you can realize that these are the keys that you've got to be watching for as you're going along. This is not just overwhelming Job with his power. He's showing Job that, look at the way I made the morning. I caused the sun to come up and the dawn to come out so that we can control the wicked, because the wicked do things at night. And you thought, Job, you made these statements that I was random, that I treated the wicked and the righteous the same. That is not true. In the design of the world, you should have seen that I made it so that the sun comes up every day, because it puts limits on how the wicked can hurt the righteous. And this is what he's trying to get Job to see. So the earth takes on form like clay under a seal and stands out like a garment. From the wicked, their light is withheld, and the upraised arm is broken. So he's trying to help Job understand that every day God is putting limits on the wicked. Maybe not the way we would like, but God is doing it in his wisdom. He's providing a framework so that the wicked can't overwhelm the righteous, but they can be there to help develop his children, just like when the sun comes up every morning. Or what about the springs of the sea in verse 16? Have you entered them? Have you walked in search of the depths? Have you gone down to like where it all began, or the springs of the sea? And have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Now, we know Job knew about resurrection, but he had no way to control it. But God's argument is going to be that I can control all these things. Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. So that God has the ability to control the gates of death, and he's storing his children up for the day of the resurrection. And this is all part of God's wisdom and the plan that he has. Or where is the way to the dwelling of light in darkness? Where is its place, that you may take it to its territory, so that you may know the paths to its home? Do you know it? Because were you born then? Or because the number of your days is great? And so some of this is overwhelming Job with the fact that he doesn't understand these things. He was not there. He doesn't have the power to control these things, doesn't understand how they work. And in the same way, Job, you should understand that you don't realize and understand how God works with the wicked and with the righteous. The wisdom that God has to train his children so they can be ready for immortality. So he goes on, look at God even uses the weather. If you entered the treasury of the snow in verse 22, or see the treasury of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war. See, again, this is not just overwhelming him with his power, but that God can use these natural things for the time of trouble. He has the wisdom to bring them in at the right time in the day of battle and war, in order to operate and bring about his purpose, really for the sake of the righteous. By what way is lightning is dispersed, or the east wind scattered over the earth? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man? See that, and this is like, come on, Job, there's not even any people there, but I still am working in such a way that I cause all these natural things to happen in order to satisfy his natural creation, to satisfy the desolate waste, and to cause it to spring forth the growth of the tender grass. Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice, and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The water is hardened like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. So God's got the knowledge and the wisdom and the control over all these things, Job, and he doesn't even require a person to be there. He's doing it even in areas where there are no people. And of course, he's able to handle the situation of your life. He goes on to, can you control the cluster of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion? And can you bring out Mizrath? That was another constellation that, at least in the NASB, that's what they took it to be in its season. Or can you guide the great bear with its cubs? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? And Job had already admitted that God made the constellations back in chapter 9. But this whole thing is designed to show, Job, I've got it all organized. It's a carefully developed and organized plan, and it's totally in God's control. So how in the world could you ever doubt the control and the wisdom of what he's brought into your life? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water may cover you? Can you send out lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the mind, or who has given understanding to the heart? It's all of God. And who can number the clouds by wisdom, or who can pour out the bottles of heaven when the dust hardens in clumps and clods cling together? See, God's got the power and the wisdom. He's going to impress Job with the fact that he can bring all these things on at the right time. We could never do that, but God can. He brings his lightnings, the water, the rain, the clouds. All these things happen at the right time, and that's all part of the wisdom of God. So I think his goal in chapter 38 was to use the inanimate creation to show God's unbelievable wisdom and power to make and sustain this creation. And the hope was that it would cause Job to rethink his challenges to God's unjust treatment of him. If this is God's wisdom and his power is so great, then maybe, Job, maybe God's been working in your life in a way you just didn't understand. And I think that's what Job actually comes to as you're going through this. And it also illustrated that God sometimes uses the natural components of our world to take care of his people and limit the wicked. This is not a random thing, Job. God does make a distinction between the righteous and the wicked. And hopefully that would cause Job to reconsider his claim that God does nothing to punish the wicked in this life, that God is just random, and that the wicked and the righteous get the same treatment. So hopefully that helped in the natural creation. Now, I stopped at that section because the next section actually starts at the end of chapter 39 with that last little section, that last paragraph there, and goes on, and end of chapter 38, and goes on into chapter 9, where God then looks at all of his variety of animals. And I think he's looking at these animals as the variety of his children. And he's trying to get Job to see beyond his own situation and realize God cares about all these animals, not just Job. And so God's plan has to be developed around the whole creation, the entire family of God, not just Job. And hopefully Job's coming to realize this as you go through these sections about the animals. So it starts in chapter 38, actually, when he talks about, can you hunt prey for the lion? So now he's moved into the living things, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait. And he's going to help Job understand that, look, do you have the wisdom to deal with the fact that in order for a lion to live, it has to eat. It preys on what we would consider an innocent little animal that lion goes and hunts and kills in order for those young lions to survive. And Job, it's not, your idea of fairness isn't really, it doesn't fit God's wisdom. Fairness is much bigger because God's dealing with the entire family, not just you, Job. And you look ahead at this and you realize, wow, this would have really helped Jesus Christ. Because although you can mention that Job was a type of Christ, and we talk about types, what this really means is that by going through this, Jesus Christ was able to work through these issues. When he read Job, he was able to work through this idea that he's going to have to suffer for the sake of all of those that he came to save. Just like in the case of a lion, that some innocent animal is going to die in order to feed them. So he goes on, who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wander for lack of food? And what God does is he has lions kill animals, they eat their fill, and then the raven feeds off of what was there. There's scavengers like that when its young ones cry to God. So God is taking care of a much bigger picture than just one individual animal. And Job, you're in the same situation. It's much bigger than just you. So he goes on in chapter 39, do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bear their young? They bow down, they bring forth their young, they deliver their offspring. See, God knows all these things, and he's designed it all to happen at the right time. Their young ones are healthy. They grow strong with grain. They depart and do not return to them. That's how God designed it. It's very similar to Ecclesiastes 3 of, there is a time. There's a time for this and a time for that. The problem is in Ecclesiastes 3, we don't know the right time, but God does. And that's what Solomon deals with in Ecclesiastes 3. You'll also notice a lot in Job 39. See that word wild in verse 1? There's going to be a lot of wild animals in Job 39. And God is trying to get Job to think beyond the nice, passive Christadelphian who comes to your Bible class and comes to meeting and sits there and does everything right. And God's trying to help him understand that I've got all these wild people I am trying to bring to my family, and you might not even care about them, but I do. And my whole plan is designed to save them as well, or at least bring them to the light. Sort of like the Apostle Paul in the conversion of Paul. He would have been like one of these wild ones that God's going to go through in chapter 39. Who sent out the wild donkey free, or who set the wild donkey free? And who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? These are donkeys that live out in the wild, away from people, and they're not domestic at all. These are wild animals. To whom I gave the wilderness for a home, and the salt land for his dwelling place. He scorns the tumult of the city, and the shoutings of the driver he does not hear. He explores the mountains for his pasture, and searches after every green thing. See, Job, he's wild, and you might not care about him because you can't domesticate him and do what you would like to do with him, but God is still taking care of him, and God may have plans for these wild animals. Well, the wild ox, which was probably one of the aurochs, which are now extinct, but would it be willing to serve you? This was a huge, look at the size of these animals. They would have been at least this big. And his argument is that, look at this guy. He looks huge, but he was wild. And he should be able to work for you really good, Job. He's strong, and he could pull a lot, and you could domesticate him and do so many great things for him, but he's wild. The way God made him, he's totally wild, and he will not do what you want him to do. Will he bed by your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes? I could put a harness on him. Or will he plow the valleys behind you? Will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? Will you trust him to bring home your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? And so Job's hopefully realizing that there are all kinds of animals out there that are beyond our control. But God has made them that way, and God takes care of them. He cares about them, and it's no different in our creation with all of God's people. Or what about the wings of the ostrich? Now, the ostrich is a wild animal. They wave proudly, but her wings and her pinions but are her wings and pinions like the kindly storks. So the contrast he's making there is between the wild ostrich, who goes around and waves her wings really proudly and runs around like crazy, as compared with a stork, who is more like a domesticated animal. For the ostrich, in verse 14, she leaves her eggs on the ground, warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain, without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. And God made them this way. There's a purpose behind this that we don't understand, but God cares about them. He provides for them, and they're an essential part of his creation. And Job, you don't see this big picture of life. Or what about the horse in verse 19? Did you give the horse his might? Did you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws in the valley and exults in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. See, we would look at that and say, that's crazy. What kind of animal would you want like that? It doesn't even care about fear, and he's not dismayed. He doesn't turn back from the sword. And he goes running into the battle because there is a purpose for the horse, and he's used for the day of battle like that. And Job, you just don't realize what I'm doing. Upon him the rattle the quiver, and the flashing spear and the javelin. With fierceness and rage he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. And so God made him this way for a reason. God's got wisdom involved in this, Job. You just didn't understand it. Or is it by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? They're very different. The horse, now we're up to the eagle flying around like this. Look at how God made all these different creatures, and he gave them what they needed to survive. That's what fair is all about. He mounts up and makes his nest on high. On the cliff he dwells and lodges upon the rocky crag, an inaccessible place. From there he spies out food. His eyes see it from afar. His young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is he. You know, and again, he ends up, this is his last one on the animal creation, but he ends again with one where other innocent animals have to die in order to sustain the hawks and the eagles like this. And Job, do you realize that what's happened here is that God has made all these animals in totally different ways, with totally different reasons, but he gives all his creatures what they need to survive. And it's not like they're going to be treated equal. No way. You don't treat them all the same. They all have different strengths and different weaknesses. And that's the way his human creation is as well. That's the way God's family is. So what God does is he gives everybody what they need in order for them to survive. But don't ever think it's going to be the same as what somebody else gets, and that's what fair is to God. So God made all these different creatures, Job, at the end of 39, and he made them all different, but he gave them what they needed to survive, but they're not treated the same. And this is part of what was lacking in Job's understanding. He thought with this idea that I do good and I do bad and I get punished, that God treated everybody the same. And God's helping him understand that, nope, the natural creation should have taught you. Just look around at what you see, and you'll realize there are different strengths and different weaknesses, but I've given them all what they need to survive. And sometimes some of what we would call the innocent suffer for the sake of others in order for them to survive. And that's the way it is in our human creation as well. So what God does in chapter 39 then is he uses the animals to prove his unbelievable wisdom and power that he has to make and sustain this creation. And it should have made Job to realize that the whole creation is God's, and it's God's to justify. This is a big issue to Job about what God's justice was all about. And in order for justice to Job, that meant that God treated everybody equal. And God is trying to get him to realize that, no, Job. No, everybody is not created equal. They're all given different strengths, different weaknesses. I give them all what they need, and I bring different events into their life in order to train them for his family. But don't ever think it's going to be the same for everybody. And it should have caused Job to rethink some of the challenges that he made about God's treatment of himself. But the other thing that comes up from this is it illustrated to Job that God designed this creation, and he cares for all the varieties of his creatures. So sometimes the innocent do die or suffer so that others could live. And hopefully Job is starting to consider now that, wait a minute, God isn't punishing Job by all that's happening to him, but he's possibly trying to save some other people that Job wasn't even aware of. I see, remember back in the beginning, Job didn't even know about the challenges that the Satan had made back in the early chapters. He wasn't aware of those things, but this is what started the whole ball rolling. So hopefully Job is being forced to think beyond himself and his own suffering situation, as bad as that was, and get outside the box, because that was the problem. Job was stuck inside a box. And it's so true that when we experience real tough suffering in our lives, when we go through real trials and we go through real bad experiences, all of us, brethren and sisters, our natural tendency is to focus on ourselves and all the things about our life and all the things that, whether we look back in guilt or whatever we do, we're all focusing on me. And what God is trying to get Job to do right now is get outside the box and see the bigger picture. And you can see how useful this would have been to Jesus Christ, because this saved Jesus from going through Job's experience. He didn't have to go through all this because he read about it. He understood it. And he took it into consideration that all these things that Jesus would suffer weren't because God was trying to punish him, but because it was necessary in order to save the many and to save Jesus Christ himself, that he was learning obedience by the things that he suffered. But his whole process, the way God had designed it, the entire plan was to save the many of God's family. So again, in chapter 40, now God stops for a moment and he says, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. See, Job realized he already had said enough. God has now got him outside of his box of the focus on himself, and he's starting to see this bigger picture of God working with a big family of creatures and God's human family that he's trying to save. So Job has been humbled to acknowledge God's wisdom and the control of his creation. But the problem is, see, this book would have ended right now if all the problems had been solved. But God can read Job's mind, and he realizes that although Job has been humbled, and although now he realizes God has a much bigger picture of what he's doing, God realizes that Job is still holding on to his own righteousness. This problem about I am right and God is wrong, my righteousness, Job is thinking that all of this life that he's developed, all these good character traits that he has are all Job's. And he doesn't yet realize that, wait a minute, Job, all of this goodness that's in you is all the result of what God has trained you for. It's all about God. It's God's righteousness, not your own. So what God does now is he throws in two more animals specifically designed to force Job to give up this idea of his own righteousness. And that's what happens with the behemoth and Leviathan as you go through into chapter 40. So this is the question now that we're going to answer, that, God's answer about who's going to be justified. And God's going to show him that, wait a minute, Job, I've got a lot more at stake here than you realize about just trying to save you. So the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind in verse 6 and said, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. Would you indeed annul, which means discredit, my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? See, this is what God is going to go after now. This idea that Job was so interested in justifying himself that he put that over and above God's justification. So, verse 9, have you an arm like God, or can you thunder a voice like his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor, and array yourself with glory and beauty. Let's go, Job. You rule the creation, right? So disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him. Now, can you do that, Job? Can you take all those people that are proud and humble them? Look on everyone who's proud and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together. Bind their faces in hidden darkness. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. See, this is about Job now. This is what God's going to do now, is bring this right down to a personal exhortation to Job. And God's challenge now to Job is going to be, how would you balance this idea of humbling proud people and destroying the wicked who don't respond so that they can be saved? How would you do it, Job? And God's going to say, look, here's what I do. And this is what he's really after. So really, the warning for us that comes out of all this, brethren and sisters, is that when we consider ourselves above other people, we've fallen into the trap of human pride. And this is what happened to Job as this whole thing developed. He ended up thinking more of his own righteousness than of God's. And when we think God is too slow to act, which is what happened with Job, we fail to realize his patience in redeeming his family. He works according to his plan and agenda, not ours. So when we think that God is too slow sometimes in going after the wicked, or he's too slow in blessing the righteous, it's because God's got a plan involved, a bigger picture than just ourselves, and his goal is to redeem a lot of people, not just me. And when we complain about specific events in our lives, what we're really doing is complaining to God that we could do a better job than him. We really aren't trusting what God has brought into our life. And when we get too caught up in our own righteousness and our own salvation, we slide into the mistake of thinking that we got the wisdom to save ourselves without God's overriding guidance and control through his angels. All of these things came from that book, The Education of Job by David Barrett. I thought it was a good summary, at least at this point, of where Job has come to and the warning for ourselves that we don't get caught up like Job in all of these things. So what God's going to do is bring in an animal called Behemoth, which is just a big monster, a big animal in this case, a big guy. And who knows? We don't know for sure exactly what this guy would have been. A lot of people think it might have been a hippopotamus. We're not really sure. If there were dinosaurs around, they certainly would have fit the bill really well. But what we're looking at in this case, like if you look at a Brontosaurus, look how much bigger it would have been than a hippo and an elephant. And if there really were dinosaurs around at some point with humans, certainly people would have realized that, wow, there's no way you're going to control this guy. So I don't really care who you take it to be, because the lesson is about the controlling of the behemoth. So what God's going to do is say, here's an animal, this animal that he describes, which I really believe that must have been a real animal that Job could have related to. And he's going to say, consider this animal, Job. This behemoth is full of self-confidence, just like you, Job. Self-confidence. And he thinks that he can just go around and take care of himself. And this is one of the things that God has to deal with. So look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. See how he's connecting it with you, Job? He eats grass like an ox. But see now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. So this is an animal who's not violent. He's not going out there and killing other animals. He eats grass like an ox. And he moves his tail like a cedar. And the sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. And his bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He ranks first among the works of God. The size of this guy, the power of this guy. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Man cannot control this. So he's not a predator. He's not like that, but he's amazingly powerful. And this guy has so much power, he's totally self-confident. But look at him in verse 20. The mountains yield food for him where all the wild beasts play. He goes right up into the mountains where the wild beasts are, and he just helps himself to the food. He just walks right through everybody and just does not a problem at all. And this is one of these areas where Neville Clark's classes are really good, because he relates this exactly to people in ecclesial life who sort of walk around with their heads up, and they walk through the ecclesia expecting everybody to notice that they're there. And that's the self-confidence that this animal has. He can go right amongst the wild beasts. Under the lotus plants he lies, and in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him, and the willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he's not frightened. He is confident, though the Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can anyone capture him when he is on watch, or pierce his nose with a snare? And so God's challenge back to Job is that, look at, this is what I see in my human creation. There are people in my family like this. As soon as God starts to develop his righteousness in us, the next step that God has to deal with is that we become self-confident. We think it's our own character. We take credit for it. And we walk around thinking that, oh, it's me, and instead of giving God the credit. And so God's challenge to Job is, do you have the wisdom and the power to contain this kind of self-confidence that's going to lead to self-righteousness? And what God's going to throw at Job is that, look, I do. And what you've gone through has been something to get this out of you, Job. You are going down a pathway where you listed all these great things that have become part of your character. In chapter 31, you did all these things you listed. Look at how good I am. And you've gone to the point now where you've got a self-confidence that's leading to a self-righteousness to where you think your righteousness is more than God's. And you don't realize that it was all about God. So the next one he brings up is Leviathan. All right, now this Leviathan, it's interesting when you look at his description. A lot of people think it might have been a crocodile. It was definitely a predator. You can connect this with the serpent of Genesis 3. You can also connect it with Daniel's fourth beast and the dragon of Revelation 12, 13, and 17. This guy. When you look at all the different places that Leviathan has shown up in the Bible, you can see there's quite a variety there, but it's always to do with this very powerful animal of the sea, and that it was something that very difficult for human people to control, but that God would punish Leviathan. He has the power to control him. So in chapter 41, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Oh, that's interesting, because Job had said back in chapter 31, he made a covenant with his eyes. He was never going to look at a woman. And God's throwing this back at him and saying, really, can you really control this, Job? Can you make this kind of thing with sin, that you're going to make a covenant with it, that you're never going to give in to sin without my help? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him up for your maidens? Will the traders bargain over him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. See, that's the power of this guy. This is a predator, a powerful predator, that if you ever try to fight this guy, you got no hope of overcoming him. In verse 9, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that would dare to stir him up. But God's claim to Job is that, look at Job, I got to deal with this. This is what pride is like in human people. And I have to take it on. I have to fight it. I've got the power and the wisdom to control this, Job, if you're willing to let me. And part of what you've gone through was so that you could learn obedience by the things that you have suffered. Who is then able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should repay him? Everything under heaven is mine. And see, that's what Paul echoes in Romans 11, this idea that all of this, everything that God has done with his whole creation is God's. And nobody can repay him for what he's doing, for the way he's changed our lives, for the grace that he's given us, the mercy that he extends to us. It's like what Paul says in Romans 11, God consigned all the disobedience that he may have mercy on all. Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. This is what Job is finally coming to. Or who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. So God does it all, but nobody can repay him for this. So back again in chapter 41, I will not keep silent concerning his limbs or his mighty strength or his goodly frame. Who can strip off his outer garment? Who would come near with a bridle? Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth is terror. His back is made of rows of shield, shut up closely as with a seal. No one is so near to another that one is so near to another that no air can come between them. They're joined one to another. They clasp each other. In other words, he's got this covering on him that's like an impenetrable shield. And his sneezings flash forth light. His eyes are like the rays of the dawn. You can't penetrate his defenses, Job. This is how deceitful pride is. You cannot get through. But God can. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals and a flame goes out of his mouth. These are the illusions that make you feel like, wow, this is very much like the dragon of Revelation 12. Strength dwells in his neck and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They're firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even his heart is the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. Job, you cannot control this. Pride is out of control, and if God doesn't do something, you won't be able to control it. He regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. The arrows cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot, and he makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is his equal. A creature without fear. He looks down on all that are haughty. He is the king over all that are proud. But see, Job, he's like one of these creatures I covered before. God made him, God takes care of him, and God will control him. But you can't. Don't think you can control this pride. So what God tried to get through to Job in chapters 40 and 41 with these two animals is how difficult it is for God to save men and women. He's got to humble them and drive out pride and sin, something that we cannot do ourselves. God alone has the wisdom to save men and women. We cannot save ourselves. We've got to learn to trust in God's wisdom and trust in his training program. And any good and righteous character that we have is all the result of what God's done in us. It's all God's righteousness, not our own. And see, this is the problem that happens as people get further into the truth. It's a warning, I think, to all of us that are older, that this is an inevitable problem as we develop characters of God, that we end up thinking it's ours and that we did it, and we did it by our power and our strength. And this is here for a warning to all of us to always reflect on the fact that any good we have is because God has done it in us. And hopefully God's seeing this. So you see the results of it in chapter 42, where the Lord answered Job and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You ask, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? That was Job. Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak, you said. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Well, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. I think when Job finally saw the big picture and realized what God was doing and how difficult and how hard God works to save us, he finally realized the deceitfulness of sin in himself and how far God had to go to work that out of Job himself. And it makes you think about New Testament passages like Romans 5, that God demonstrates his own love toward us, that and while we were sinners, Christ died for us. This is the extent that our God is willing to go to save us, of giving his own son when we were sinners, when we didn't deserve it. And he did all of this for us because he loves us. Whereas our readings in John just a week ago or so, he said in 1 John 4:16, so we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. And by this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment. Not self-confidence, confidence in God, because as is he, so also we are in this world. And there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. And whoever fears has not been perfected in love. And so this is the result of turning our lives over to God's training program. We develop a relationship with God. We trust him. We rely on him. We realize he's always right. And whatever he brings into our life, it is for our good, because he's trying to train us to share his holiness. So after all this, God's angry at Job's three friends. The Lord said to Eliphaz, the Temanite, my wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. I think that's a good warning to all of us, that we've got to be careful about how we represent God to other people, especially people that are going through rough times. Now, therefore, you had to take bulls and offer them, go to Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Job did say the right things about God. The problem was he ended up thinking that his righteousness was more than God's. So it really is important that we get a good understanding of this training program. I think it's also a good lesson for us tonight that prayer changes things. God accepted Job's prayer and saved these people. Whereas, without that prayer, the implication is that God would have dealt with them in a different way. And I think that's a good warning for us today and encouragement that prayer really does matter. Luke 18, that parable Jesus gave of the persistent woman, to the effect that we ought to always pray and not lose heart. It may take a while because it's all under God's plan. So in the end, God did restore Job's. You'll notice down in verse 10 that the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. I think that's a good lesson for us too, that we've got to be praying for people, even people that have said things against us and people that maybe we count as our enemies like Job had, that we pray for people and God will respond to that. And God gave him twice as much as what he had before. And I know you can't replace your children, but God did try to bless him with what he could. And again, it was for all the adversity that the Lord brought upon him. So everybody in this story knew that God had done it. And God blessed the latter days of Job more than at the beginning. And, it tells you all about the children that he got and so on. So God let Job live a long time. Look at that. After this, he lived 140 years in verse 16. Saw his children and his grandchildren for 4 generations. He would have been able to help people understand how God trains his children. And finally, he died old in 4 days. So I think it's good to look back at what did everybody learn from Job's experiences? Well, if you went back to the beginning with the Satan, The Satan started off with this premise that Job only served God because God blessed him. And so the Satan came up with all these ideas of take away this, take away that, take away all these things. And so God did. And in the end, Satan was shown to be wrong. Job still held fast to his way of life. He still served God and proved that the Satan was wrong. And then the Satan passes off the scene. So then the three friends come along and they push Job. And they push Job with this idea that you must be a terrible sinner. But they learned in the end that God doesn't punish us in this life according to our sins. God sometimes uses suffering to prevent us from falling into sin. He uses it in a preventive way. And God does sometimes punish the wicked in this life. Sometimes, but not always. But when he does, it's usually for the sake of God's children. So the three friends were wrong too. And Job himself, all of his righteousness he had to learn was the result of God's working in his life. We have no righteousness apart from God's. And God has the wisdom and the power and the control to justly balance what he brings into the lives of all his children, just like he does with the inanimate creation and with the animal creation. God is always just and he's fair. It's just not equal. So in that, Job was wrong. And hopefully all those things got passed on. And of course, Jesus, as he read through this, would have learned that the righteous sometimes need to suffer for the sake of others. This is what we really mean by Jesus, by Job being a type of Jesus. It's not just that he was a type and he acted out things like Jesus would go through. Jesus read these stories and he learned from them by these people. The way it was recorded, it was able to help Jesus work through these issues. And he found out that Job lived out for him the idea that you don't complain about when you're suffering for others, because God's in control and he's working with other people and he's trying to bring them to God. So yes, sometimes innocent people do suffer for the sake of other people. And Jesus would have also learned to never claim that God is not fair. God is always right and he's just. And Jesus always, when people came up to him and said, "Good master," he always said, "Don't call me good, because there's only one that's good, and that's God." And he would have learned from Job to never cross that line of thinking that it was his own righteousness. So I'll leave you with the Proverbs 6. This is all about Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. To trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. And in all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. This is what people do that have a relationship with God. They trust him in everything. They understand his training program, and they rely on God to take care of it. And as Paul said in Philippians 1, I am sure that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So from Job and his three friends, let's thank God that we've learned about his training program, and thank God that he trains us. He's willing to send out his angels and train us day by day to develop us into his children, to share the image of Jesus Christ so we can join his family forever.